Hello?
Hey, Rich, it's Larson. You got a minute?
Sure, Larson. What's up?
Hello and welcome to the Got a Minute podcast. This is Larson Hicks, and I am joined by my co-host, Pastor Rich Lusk. How's it going, sir?
Yeah, great to be with you, Larson. It's been a while.
It has, we say it every time, but we'll just keep plugging away and hopefully get a little bit more consistent about doing these more frequently. I understand you've launched a new podcast. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so Pastor Bill Smith and I have been longtime friends, and Bill's I actually knew Bill when I was a pastor in Louisiana, and I was in North Louisiana, he was in South Louisiana. We were both in the PCA at the time. Obviously now both in the Series C. I'm here in Birmingham. He is in Carbondale, Illinois now at a Series C church there. And we've talked for years about all kinds of issues. He had a bunch of sons. I had one, and now I've got sons-in-law. But one thing that we had talked about a lot over the years is marriage, particularly preparing. We always talked about preparing young men and young women for marriage, but especially young men, helping young men find a vocation, that kind of thing. At one point, we had talked about writing a book, and then we kind of shifted gears and decided before we do that, we'd try doing a podcast and just see how that goes. So, it's not a real fancy podcast. It's not one of those pretty boy podcasts that's got, all the, it's kind of like Got a Minute, it's super low budget. We're really focused on content and just trying to pump out content that would be helpful for young men. So the name of the podcast is Collars and Calluses, trying to bring together, obviously not just clergy collars, but, white collar, blue collar, and clergy collar, the kind of work we do out in the world. But then, of course, Bill and I being pastors, that does kind of put an emphasis on clergy collar. So two pastors getting together to talk about manly things, masculinity. And of course, the calluses part is just, you got to be a man who is tough, who knows how to work and that kind of thing. So trying to emphasize that a little bit. So it's been good. We've recorded a few episodes. I think a couple have been released. We just did one the other day in light of the Charlie Kirk incident on violence, righteous and unrighteous violence, and the fact that men are programmed by God to have this natural instinct to protect, even if that means using violence is actually good. But of course, in a fallen world, it can go wrong. And so young men have to learn how to channel their innate aggressiveness and competitiveness and even their capacity for violence to good ends. Violence is usually not the answer to our problems, but every now and then it is. And so you've got to be ready when it is. But more than that, just as men thinking through what is a masculine response to what's going on in our culture, and wanting to, I've seen some overzealous young men say, now's the time to take up arms, that kind of thing. It's like, no, there's no physical enemy standing in front of you for you to go fight that, don't go seek one out. That's really not going to be the answer to what we're facing. We do need to fight, but that's not really the kind of battle that we're in, and that's not how we're going to win this battle. And so we've got to understand that as well. So what happened with Charlie Kirk is tragic, and we'll talk about that more in just a minute. And I think it's going to have a lasting impact on our culture, and particularly on young men, since that was really his demographic and that's who he represented. It really is true that a lot of young men see themselves in Charlie, and so when he got shot, that's. They took it very personally, as I think they should. That's very understandable. So,
yeah.
But yeah, if you're looking for the podcast, I'll just say this: the podcast I'm doing with Bill, it's Collars and Calluses, and you should be able to find it, all the same places that you find the Got a Minute podcast. So
cool. Well, it's awesome, man. I'm a big fan of podcasts. We actually just a mature lady in our church record a kind of a short form, video for younger moms in the church, just talking about some practical wisdom of just keeping house and running a home. And the idea is just like, whether we like it or not, like I think we can sit around and complain that people don't read books anymore, don't read long form articles, but the reality is just that our lives are different, and people are commuting to school and work and wherever, and we all have these smartphones in our pockets, and so it's just easy. It's really, really easy to pop on a podcast while you're mowing the lawn or doing the dishes or driving or whatever. And it's a way that people consume information these days. And frankly, I think it's, I think the casual, informal conversation, like the one you and I are having right now, it's a more, at some level, I think it's a more effective means of getting, information, sort of having information actually land. I think that the stand and deliver kind of lecture format of college is not really, it may be the most efficient way to get a lot of information out, but it's not really the most effective way to have it stick. And so I actually think that the dialogue, the natural dialogue, works really well for getting people to sort of enter into the conversation and really engage with the material. So I'm a big fan, and think we should be doing more of it.
I think there's a lot to that. I mean, I'm old school and always will be. I want people to read books. I want people to read the long form articles. I want, I'm not opposed to lecture style teaching and that kind of thing. But I do think that podcasting and the kind of conversational back and forth that you have on something like this, or what Bill and I are trying to do with Collars and Calluses, is super helpful. And now, obviously, a lot of people have found it engaging. And I do agree with you that podcasting is helpful because there are so many ways, so many opportunities for people to listen to podcasts. Just the way our lives are set up, you're right. You've got your smartphone with you everywhere you go. You're often in the car, or you're out getting exercise or whatever, going to the gym, and you can listen to something. You can kind of multitask, and if it's good content, it's worth doing. So it's good.
Let's talk about Charlie. I mean, obviously, we didn't plan before today what we were going to talk about, but it seems like the obvious thing to talk about. I know you and Bill already have. My it's just been such a whirlwind of a week. For me, just processing all of this and trying to figure out what next. Like, what do we do about this? I do really believe that this idea that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. I think that there is nothing more powerful in the world for advancing the gospel than for a good Christian man to be killed for his faith. And this is a truth and a reality that Satan and his demons seem to continue to forget or be unable to help themselves. But it's a true thing. And I think that, I posted on X that I thought that Charlie's death would be the starting gun for 100,000 Charlies, to take up his work. And that's probably a low estimate, just in terms of the number of people who are saying no, no more messing around, no more, half measures. I'm going all in because this man laid his life down, for this cause. So, and obviously this is true in the history of the Christian church. The death of the martyrs, the martyrdom of the apostles has to be the most powerful testimony to the veracity of Christ and his resurrection and the gospel. And without a doubt, those deaths, I'm certain are what, catapulted the church forward.
Yeah. So there are several things about it that stand out to me. I mean, first of all, I do think you're right that the blood of the martyrs is seed. While Charlie's life was all too short, he did not die in vain. And I think will have a larger impact in his death than he could have had if he lived, which is not to somehow justify it, or I'm not, what happened is evil and I wish it hadn't happened. The world was certainly better with Charlie here, but I do think you're right. I think that you will see God raise up men to take his place. You will see men step up to take his place. But several things stand out to me. One is I don't think we can call Charlie the first American martyr, in the sense that we've certainly had other people on American soil die for their faith. You might think of, church shootings we've had or Christian school shootings. I think those can be considered cases of martyrdom. But it is certainly a unique kind of martyrdom that we have not seen on American soil to this point. And I don't think Charlie will be the last, but so he may be the first martyr of that sort. I don't think he'll be the last. But I do think there's a very real sense in which he is the first martyr of this sort that we have seen on American soil. And that's hugely significant. Because I think the name of his ministry was Turning Point, and I do think this represents a turning point. I think it represents a turning point for the leftists and for the conservative Christians. For the leftists, who now have to recognize what their ideology produces, and for Christians, conservative Christians, recognizing the depth of the battle that we are in, and what it's going to take to win it, and how we need to double down and do everything necessary to win it. And when I say that, of course, I'm saying everything necessary that is in accord with what God has called us to do and commissioned us to do as a church. It's not anything goes. Another thing that really stood out to me about Charlie, and I mean, I've known about Charlie Kirk for years. Charlie actually grew up very close to where I grew up, out right outside of Chicago. And I was familiar with Turning Point from years back, and it kind of seemed to me like a somewhat sort of generic conservative political organization early on. But I think over time it morphed and matured as Charlie himself morphed and matured, especially in his Christian faith. And so he became much more outspoken as a Christian. He created a faith division for TPUSA that basically was focused on promoting and defending Christian faith specifically. So, and applying Christian faith to the public square. But a couple of things really stand out to me about Charlie as he matured. I mean, he died at 31, so he obviously still had more. He would, who knows what Charlie might have accomplished had he lived another 40 years or 50 years. And I've heard some say, well, Charlie would have eventually been president. That's actually very believable to me, because he just had so many great qualities and a natural leader, a sort of natural alpha male. But a couple of things that really stand out to me is, one, how likable he is. When he's engaging, even with people who are very hostile to him, he's very likable. Just the way that he would engage with people, but also how ordinary he is in a sense. I mean, all the positions he held were basically, I would just sort of say, mainstream, sort of run-of-the-mill conservative Christian positions that really ought not to be controversial. To say things like, Jesus is the only way of salvation, or to say men are men and women are women, or, to say, get married, have kids, work hard, go to church. I mean, this is just kind of nuts and bolts type advice. There's nothing fancy about this. I mean, that's one thing that struck me, is how ordinary the whole thing is. And yet, because our culture is so morally insane, because our culture is so deranged, Charlie saying the most ordinary things is now offensive, and it sounds radical. And, the reality is it's just not. I mean, it made him a target, And then one other thing that I'll say is the reactions. I think the reaction on the right has been very healthy, as I've seen pointed out by several people. How many riots have there been? How much mob violence have you seen after Charlie's death? How many murders have you seen in the wake of Charlie's death? 0, 0, 0. We haven't seen any of that, because that's not how the right does things. And I think that's becoming very plain. The divergence between the right and the left, especially when it comes to things like political violence. So you can compare this to incidents when, say something like the George Floyd, mostly peaceful protests, the riots after George Floyd. Nothing like that, because the right doesn't do that. What does the right do? The right gathers for prayer. We sing hymns. We encourage one another, but we're not out there just destroying property or lives, for that matter. So I think you see that. But then also the number of people that you had that were just outright gleeful over his death. And obviously they're revealing their own depravity when they do that. But I think they're also revealing the fact that Charlie was he was being effective. That's a kind of demonic response. And this tells you that the demons were angry about what Charlie was doing, which tells you that Charlie was doing something right. You don't have to say it was perfect. You don't have to agree with everything everything said, obviously. But I think Charlie really did represent us as historic Christians really, really well in that domain, particularly on college campuses. And I think the reaction shows you that the enemy recognized. I mean, that's why Charlie was a target, because he was so effective. And the response of the enemy after his death, I think, makes it very clear that Charlie was being incredibly effective in what he was doing.
Yeah, I totally agree. I listened to just this morning, a little bit last night, and this morning I listened to the Stories Are Soul Food podcast with Nate Wilson and Brian Cole, and Nate's take, N.D. Wilson, his take on this is really phenomenal. He's a story guy, right, and he's just got a particular lens that he sees things through. But it was profound. I recommend that podcast to anybody who's in the midst of processing. But one of the things that stood out to me about his commentary was just the simplicity of Charlie's work, and kind of the principle, the Sun Tzu kind of Art of War principle of concentration, and just the idea that if you do the same thing over and over and over and over and over again, you will become good at it, and it will make an impact. If you ram into the wall of a castle at the same place over and over and over, eventually it's going to come down. And, Charlie, wanted to get into West Point, and, thank God he didn't, because who knows what, what would have happened. He took a picnic table and went and stood it up in the lawn of a college. And he just did this thing over and over and over. And I have no idea what it sounded like the first time he did it, but clearly over time, he really honed his craft and became excellent at it. And that biblical principle that you see a man good at his work, he'll stand before kings. Just the diligence and the focus and the consistency of his ministry, I think, and doing something very ordinary and very simple. I think there's a real message for the church that my message to our church on Sunday was, you don't have to go speak on college campuses, to be courageous and effective. That there are a zillion ordinary things that you can do faithfully and courageously. And if you, again, this principle of concentration, if you do it consistently day after day, over and over, and get incrementally better as you go, you're going to make a massive impact. And this guy was doing this for 13 years, it's just incredible.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. I would say that Charlie is a guy who really did hone his craft. He became incredibly competent at what he set out to do. And that's something that all men can learn from and emulate. Whatever it is God's called you to do, learn how to do it with excellence. And that does require dedication to your craft, to your vocation. That does require a lot of hard work. But it's definitely worth it. We are to strive to do our work with excellence. And Charlie did that. Charlie became the best on-campus defender of the Christian faith and of I guess you could just say the Christian worldview, really in our time. And I think he really deserves honor because of that. The other thing I would say about that is to do what he did, yes, it requires hard work. It also required a great deal of courage and poise. So courage to really go into what is really hostile territory, which you might think of as enemy territory, because that's really what university campuses often are, because they're so dominated by progressivism, various left-wing ideologies, to go into sort of the lion's den, so to speak, and just say, hey, prove me wrong. Let's have this discussion. let's just have an open debate. And of course, as so many have pointed out, I mean, his his efforts to argue, debate, and persuade were supposed to be the alternative to political violence, which that's the way he saw it. That's not the way his shooter saw it, obviously. And it's also interesting to me that there's obviously all kinds of misinformation floating around out there. I think part of what we're dealing with is that so much of, one of the things we were actually planning to talk about today before this Charlie Kirk thing happened was the therapeutic turn and therapeutic culture. And what are we to make of the fact that so-called mental illness is so widespread in our culture? And actually the statistics show actually it's way more common on the left than it is on the right. And it's way more common with women than it is with men, but it's especially left-wing women, who are the most mentally disturbed people in the whole society. But what I find really interesting is that so many on the left, they really think if you disagree with them, you hate them. Like Charlie's willingness to have open dialogue is interpreted as hate. I mean, even the shooter, it seems that this is how he was interpreting things Charlie said. Because Charlie disagrees, therefore he hates. No, that's simply not true. Just because you disagree doesn't mean you're full of malice towards someone. You can disagree while still while still loving someone. I mean, absolutely. That's just a reality. But the left is so spiritually immature and spiritually lost.
Right. Yeah. One of the failures, the massive failures of education from kindergarten on up is this idea, I think this very flawed idea that education is about transferring data from a teacher to a student. And I think it's one of the massive ways that we're failing our students, even at Christian schools, is we're standing and delivering a bunch of content, and they're supposed to, and we're calling it education because by the end, supposedly they'll have all of this content in their brain, and that makes them educated. And the problem I think you see as you watch Charlie Kirk videos is that it's not that these people don't have content in their heads. Like someone delivered a position, but these students have never been taught to think. They've never been taught to think rationally, to interrogate ideas logically, and so the idea is that really your feelings and about things are really the primary truth. You're and it's your truth, and it doesn't matter what anybody else says. If you feel it's right, then it's right. And it's hate. It's hate to deny that or to disagree with that, because you're basically saying, I hate this thing about you, and so this idea, like I think from kindergarten, our kids should be engaged in discussion and debate, and we should be teaching them how to reason, and so I think that's one of the massive contributors, I think, to this problem that we're seeing today, where, as you said, simple kind of disagreement is viewed as hate, and not an opportunity for a discussion. And just like I really enjoy the All In podcast, which I think like the most popular podcast in the country, but it's all these Silicon Valley entrepreneur guys. One of them's now part of Trump's administration, but they were all super liberal, in California just, a couple of years ago, kind of pre-COVID. And then just kind of, they've all sort of, most of them have moved slowly to the right, some very far right, but not very far right, but they've all moved to the right. And what's really refreshing about their conversations is that they are supreme. Like several of them are billionaires. Most of them are hundreds of millionaires. These are very, very successful, brilliant guys. And what's delightful about their conversations is these are men who know how to think and how to reason, and they disagree vehemently with each other in real time, and so listening to it's again, what Charlie did was amazing and incredible. I think one of the ways that people try to write it off as well, he's just dealing with, uneducated college kids and not with his equals, which I think is false. It's a open microphone, and he had lots of professors, come try to debate with him as well. But it is really delightful to hear grown men have debates and disagreements, and your comment earlier about your podcast with Bill and how you guys were thinking about, Charlie Kirk in the light of masculinity. I think, he is a wonderful picture. And I think he was kind of a big brother to a whole generation of kids who saw an example of somebody with self-control, with control over his emotions. It's not only really brave for him to be there, but it's impressive to see as he's being taunted, as he's being baited into name calling and just called awful things, to see him have such control over his emotions. I think that's been just a powerful example to men who look at that and go, oh, that's actual strength. That's actual meekness, that I want to emulate.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really, really good. I want to talk about another aspect of this that I think is very important for us to consider. So it seems to me that within evangelicalism, at least over the last 10 or so years, you've had basically two different approaches. And when I say evangelicalism here, I'm including basically all people that would identify as more or less conservative Christians. That would include Reformed churches as well. I'm kind of using evangelical in a broad sense here. And you've kind of had two different approaches emerge over the last, 10 plus years. And I think that the two representatives of the two approaches maybe could be best understood as Charlie Kirk and Tim Keller. Now, on Charlie Kirk's side, you could also put somebody like Doug Wilson. On the Tim Keller side, you could put Russell Moore, David French, guys like that. But the basic difference comes down to this. With Tim Keller, it seems to me, and Moore, French, Keller never, these things were laid out in various ways. A lot of times this was referred to as gospel centeredness or something like that. But, the basic idea is that we do not fight the culture war because that interferes with evangelism. And, like in Keller's case, I think it's pretty obvious. He didn't have a worked out political philosophy per se. What he had is political positions that were tailored in order to serve an evangelistic agenda. And so with Keller, politics gets subordinated to evangelism. And so you're not going to talk about various political or cultural issues that the unbeliever finds especially offensive. Think about Kristen Powers, who attended Keller's church for a long time, some period of time, and did not know that the church was opposed to homosexuality and opposed to abortion. Found that out later and said, I was just going by what I heard in the pulpit. Well, if the pulpit never made it clear, if it never became clear in public worship that you're opposed to homosexuality and abortion, then I'd say that's a real problem. Like, people should know where you stand on those issues, not because you talk about them every Sunday. And it's just something that has to be in the sermon. It could also be something that pops up in the pastoral prayer or something like that. But it should be well known about your church that these are your convictions about these things. And so in a way, what you're doing in that particular approach is you are trying to keep all the offensive parts of Christianity out of the public eye, segment them over to the side so that they don't interfere with evangelism. And I guess the hope is that you'll just deal with those things later when they come up. I think that's a really bad strategy. It's a strategy that obviously Keller in particular suited to the sort of urban sensibilities of the people that he was seeking to minister to. And I do respect a great deal about Keller's ministry. I think there were many things he did very well and much about what he did that was certainly effective. But I think this was a real problem. And the real problem is that this is at the center of his legacy, is this refusing to engage in what are called culture war issues, sort of laying down your sword on those issues, surrendering, and then trying to talk about just the gospel without getting into any of those other things. Charlie Kirk took the exact opposite approach. I think politics and faith are always connected anyway, so you can't really mix things that are already joined together. But I'll just put it this way: his politics and his evangelism were always mixed together, and he would move seamlessly from talking about Jesus as the only Savior to talking about what the Bible has to say about immigration or free markets or education or family or sex and gender, and he would just move back and forth between all these things. And I actually think that in this particular case, Kirk's approach is far, far, far more faithful and apostolic and biblical than Keller's approach. I think Kirk understood that evangelism and the culture war go hand in hand, and you can't really do evangelism without also fighting the culture war. If you're going to evangelize people, they need to know what side of the battle of the day they're joining. They need to understand they're being drafted into an army if they convert, and what battles is this army fighting. They need to know that. Now, it doesn't mean they have to understand everything at once, obviously, but I think what Kirk did is that he showed that the Christian worldview really is a seamless whole. And so the same Bible that teaches us the way to salvation also teaches us about all these other things that are going on in the culture around us, like sexuality and abortion and family structure and the economy and work and all these other things. And so, whereas for Keller, I'd say you have something of a reductionistic gospel, a very narrow gospel, a gospel that is abstracted, a gospel that's above the fray, so to speak. Okay? For Kirk, you have a gospel that actually touches where we live. The whole counsel of God is being proclaimed. And so the question I would ask is, which one of those looks more like the apostolic ministry that we see in the New Testament? And I would say there's no question that it is Kirk's. Like, you think about, Paul writing the letter to the Roman Christians. What does he do there? Well, you can't even get through the first full chapter, and he's talking about sodomy and the horrors of sodomy, and how this is contrary to God's design, contrary to nature, and that idolatry and immorality go together. So that's on the leading edge of Paul's message. Or you think about how Paul talks about the Gentiles in Ephesians chapter 4, who have darkened minds and depraved hearts, and he talks about how Christians don't live as the Gentiles do, and then he spells out in all these different areas what that looks like, from work to family to music. I mean, all different kinds of ways in which the Christian way of life, Christians are basically creating a counterculture, and it stands against the widespread culture of the Greco-Roman world. Or when Paul goes into the city in the book of Acts, what happens so often? They want to stone him, or there's a riot. And why is that? It's because the gospel he preaches is not this abstract message of salvation. It's not a privatized message of salvation. He's preaching the comprehensive lordship of Jesus, which challenges everything about the world that he lives in. It's a total challenge to the status quo. And I think that's kind of what Kirk was doing when he went onto a college campus. He was challenging the status quo at every point. Whereas if you look at what Keller did in Manhattan, he's not challenging the status quo. He's not challenging common practices or beliefs on abortion or homosexuality or what have you. He's just not going to talk about those things.
And I think the courage that I think, Charlie is an antithesis to those kinds of men, because of the courage to deal with anything and everything, and to come into a campus and say, ask me anything, let's talk about anything. And we all know, the elephants in the room that that are being carefully tiptoed around. And of course, college kids are going to go right up to it and point at it and say, what's this? And so there's a quote. I don't think this may be apocryphal or at least not an exact quote from Martin Luther, but we've probably all heard some version of this, but I'll read it because I think it's relevant. If I profess with the loudest voice and clearest exposition every portion of the truth of God, except precisely that little point which the world and the devil are at the moment attacking, I am not confessing Christ, however boldly I may be professing him. Where the battle rages, there the loyalty of the soldier is proved, and to be steady on all the battlefield besides is merely flight and disgrace if he flinches at that point. So I know that's been quoted by others and or some version of that, whether it's it's Luther, or it's a distillation of Luther that
Probably not Luther, but it captures Luther's spirit for sure.
captures Luther's spirit. And what you're describing is absolutely the case. And I think the fact that, I mean, just to come back to this point we made earlier, that the fact that Charlie Kirk's really very centric, centrist Christianity, the fact that that version of Christianity is so offensive and seems so radical, even to Christians. We watch a video like that and go, well, that guy's really radical, even though his points are basic Christian orthodoxy. The fact that he's talking about these things feels radical and extreme. It's kind of a frog in the pot kind of situation, right? We've been conditioned by evangelical leadership for the last century or so that what you said is true, that being gospel centered is being attractional, and it's being winsome, which means we don't talk about what the culture actually is wrestling with right now. We avoid those topics, and so yeah, I think your point is totally true. What I would say, another aspect of this that I think is interesting, I'm seeing pastors, who are trying to deny, sort of that Charlie's a martyr, or that Charlie was a serious Christian, because of his promotion of Donald Trump. And there's this kind of, I don't know what you call it, it's not a Jesus juke, but there's this breed of Christianity that wants to remain squeaky clean and have no public association with anything that may be controversial or unsavory. And so Trump is all of those things. He's controversial and unsavory. And so there's this sense that, I can't say I would rather have Donald Trump as president than Joe Biden. Somehow that's been construed, and I really think by our enemies, I think by the left, that's been construed as a wholehearted endorsement of Trump as the ideal Christian man. Like you are, by voting for Trump, you are saying that man is qualified to be an elder and a pastor of a church, and he's the standard. And the reality is, of course, we would love to have a more godly man and a more faithful Christian in office, but he's not. We're not talking about ordaining him to be a pastor, and so I think, but what's happening is, I mean, Trump's already been attacked and vilified, and there's been so much effective propaganda over a long period of time now, that there are so many people in our country who are just convinced to the core that Trump is a racist, Trump is a neo-Nazi, Trump hates black people and is trying to become this fascist dictator. And so now anybody who supports Trump or MAGA is now also, by extension, a racist. And so the idea that you could be supportive of Trump and not be is just incomprehensible.
That kind of polarization has taken place, and certainly social media is to blame for some of that, because people live in their little bubbles that may be completely detached from reality. I think the media also bears a great deal of blame, because the media has pushed that kind of narrative. I mean, even in the case of Charlie Kirk's death, I think the media bears some measure of blame, just because they pushed this narrative so hard that everyone on the right, everyone who voted for Trump is a Nazi. Everyone who voted for Trump is a racist. Everyone who voted for Trump, deserves a bullet.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter if we've got hours and hours of tape worth of quotes of Charlie Kirk interacting with black people on issues of race.
Candace Owens has been one of his best friends for years. I mean, it just, the whole idea is just nonsense. Let me go back and say something about Trump, what you said with Trump. And I mean, I think most of us, I think certainly the guys, the people who would listen to this podcast, are not under any illusions as to the shortcomings with regard to Trump's theology and morality. I mean, none of us would defend certain things that Trump has said or done throughout the course of his life. He's a sinner. I didn't vote for Trump because I think he is some paragon of virtue. I voted for Trump because I thought he was better than the alternative. And there really only are two alternatives. And I voted for Trump because I want to use Trump. I'm using Trump to accomplish certain things I want to see happen. Okay. Not because I'm somehow, I'm not fawning all over Trump, although I think Trump has actually exceeded my expectations in all kinds of ways. I'm very grateful for that. But I voted for him because I want to use him to accomplish certain things in the political arena. And many of those things he has accomplished or is working towards accomplishing. So I voted for Trump because I knew that his administration would fit much better with the things I want to see happen and would go much further towards accomplishing those things. So it's not like, oh, Trump, whatever you do is right. No, I've got an agenda I want to accomplish. Trump doesn't line up with all of it, but he lines up with a good bit of it. And so, and the Democratic candidate doesn't line up with any of it. And so therefore I vote for Trump because that's going to accomplish more of the agenda I have. But my agenda is not Trump. My agenda is separate from Trump, and Trump is judged according to the agenda. Trump doesn't become the agenda.
Yeah. Yeah. As you're talking there, I think about how incredibly, powerful this desire to be respectable or cool or politically correct, how incredibly powerful that is. And I think about, it's fear of man. It's or you could call it love of man, right? But I think that, and I'm thinking about school a lot right now because we're thinking about starting a school here in Huntsville. And I think about how early, one of my beefs with like the traditional K through 12, like age segregated school model versus something that's more cohorts and less and more age integrated is there is this pressure, I think, from very, very young in a school environment to be cool. And that's just not there, like in a family. Like when you're in a family with older brothers and little brothers, the desire to be cool just really isn't there. And I see it. I mean, I've got a kid, one of my children most of my kids are homeschooled right now, but I've got one that is going to school, and I see it, instantly. Like as soon as he gets into a classroom environment, he wants to prove to his classmates that he's cool, that he's hip, that he knows what's what. And that, like, I think that we don't address that head on enough, and we haven't solved for that well enough, I think, in our children's education. And so that desire to be accepted, to be cool, to fit in, kind of stays with them and really grows and increases and becomes a part of their lifestyle for their whole life. And then you get to an office where, I might get in trouble if I say these things and express these opinions, and it's not really cool to be a normie and conservative. And so, it may feel like I'm being arbitrary, that like, really, do you think someone shot Charlie Kirk because they wanted to be cool? But I really think that I think it starts there. I think wanting to be accepted by kind of the, not necessarily like there's like a zeitgeist and there's sort of a spirit of the age, wanting to fit in with that from a very early age. I want to, all the cool kids are listening to Taylor Swift. I better listen to Taylor Swift. Right. And you can see how that leads over time to this kind of complete indoctrination and assimilation into the world that hates God. Right. And hates his image and everything else. So, yeah, I'm interested in rooting that out in my life, but also in my home and in our church, and the idea of being, eccentric, being weird, being, standing out, or just not caring, just having the kind of confidence to stand up with your shoulders back and and not have to get approval, about and self, self regulate and edit, all the time in order to try to make sure you don't expose yourself as out yourself as somebody who's not cool. I just think that's such a massive idol.
I know we need to get towards wrapping this up. This is where I think the vibe shift that's taken place is so significant because what's cool can certainly change. And I don't want to act like, conservative or Christian is just another fad. Certainly not. But this is the thing. For a long time now, our culture has lived under the progressive gaze, the progressive gaze. So it's kind of, I mean, Joe Rigney uses the example. It's kind of like you've got a little progressive sitting on your shoulder, overlooking what you're doing and criticizing you if you don't adopt all the progressive slogans and ways of thinking, that kind of thing. And so, I mean, I've seen this with pastors where pastors don't want to offend that imaginary progressive sitting on their shoulder. They don't want to offend the real progressive out there in the congregation or in the world. And so they trim the sails to fit the prevailing winds. They don't say anything that's going to be overtly challenging to the leftist progressive worldview. They live under that gaze. It's a form of the fear of man. Instead of fearing God, they fear man. They want man's approval. They want the approval of the left, or at least they want to show the left they're not like those bad guys, the really conservative Christians or the really right-wing Christians. And so they're very careful what they say. I mean, Tim Keller is a perfect example of this. I mean, Tim Keller lived under the progressive gaze. That's why he would not talk about abortion and homosexuality from the pulpit, because he lived under the progressive gaze. He wasn't going to say anything that would offend those progressive sensibilities in Manhattan. And I think that's just the fear of man, basically. That's seeking men's approval rather than God's. Now, this is the thing. We will know we live in a Christian nation once again when non-Christians are living under the Christian gaze. Okay, when they're concerned, what are those Christians going to think of me? What would Christians say about me if I did this or said that? And we're nowhere near that. But I do think the vibe shift is real. And I think the vibe shift has happened for a number of reasons. I mean, COVID was part of that. Trump getting elected multiple times was part of that. There are a lot of things that have been a part of that, where the cool factor that used to be entirely on the left is now shifting towards the right. And I think you see this especially with so many young people, and it's particularly young men, young women, not as much, but young men particularly coming back to historic Christian faith and to the church and to more conservative views on a wide range of things. And, whether or not that sticks, I mean, we'll have to see. Is this rocky soil where the seed's been planted, or is it good soil where the seed has been planted? We'll have to see what happens in the years to come, particularly with Gen Z. But I do think that the vibe shift is real. And I don't think that the cool factor exists on the left in the way that it once did. And I think there's a lot of, I think there's a reason why so many people are drawn to the right now, particularly young people. When I look at people on the left, they don't look like they're having much fun. I mean, I would say, people on the left are just sort of depraved hedonists, but I don't think they're really having that much fun on the left. Whereas I think there's a lot of joy and a lot of enjoyment on the right. And maybe that's because the right is more in touch with reality. You've got more Christians who know how to give thanks, which unlocks enjoyment of God's gifts. But you're just more in touch with reality on the right. And there's a lot more joy. There's a lot more happiness. I mean, again, even the statistics bear this out. There's a lot more mental illness and dysfunction of various sorts on the left than there is on the right. And that's hugely significant.
Well, and this is, I do think this Charlie Kirk assassination is another COVID kind of moment. We've talked about COVID as being apocalyptic in that it was it was an unveiling of things, and it's been, it's become a daily sort of habit of mine here in this last week to get on Twitter and just scroll through, and it's just amazing to see the number of people who are posting, I went to church for the first time, I bought a Bible for the first time, I've been a liberal my whole life and I'm done with it, or the people, and what I think's happened is, the gleeful demonic, reactions to Charlie's assassination, reveal, like, that wasn't rehearsed, that wasn't made up, that is the abundance of the heart speaking. And I think people who are not all the way in yet and have not gone over the edge are looking at that and going, wow, this is really dark. Are these really my people? Is this my tribe? Is this where I want to be? And so, one of the things that I said on Sunday was, that the story of Stephen, and Stephen is very much a, Charlie Kirk of his day. I mean, he was just, ask me anything, let's go. I'm happy to throw down and talk about my beliefs, in front of any audience, and it got him killed as well. But Luke sets up the introduction of Saul and Paul in that story. It ends with Saul standing there approving, and then continuing to breathe threats and murder, and it describes those who are listening to Stephen's sermon as grinding their teeth. And I think about how many. And then when Saul was converted on the road to Damascus, what was the instrument of his conviction of sin that Jesus used? He said, Saul, why have you been persecuting me? So Jesus confronts Saul with his participation in persecution and martyrdom, as a way to reveal to him. Saul responds, who are you? And he says, I'm Jesus, who you have been persecuting. And so I think that we are, I think in the days ahead, and I think we've already seen in this last week, that there are Sauls all over the country who are being confronted and having Damascus Road like collisions with Jesus right now. And I'm praying that there's going to be more and more of that. I'll just add a couple other kind of closing thoughts, Rich. One is, I think I just want to reiterate that I don't think our solution, I think this has been revealing, and it's discouraging and dark, but there's so much also signs of great fruit and revival that I think are also to be grasped here. But I think the solution, the answer, the hope that we have is not for a revolution or some systemic change. I think that the Christian nationalist mindset that so many in our circles have, of like, what we really just need is a Christian nation. Of course, I want a Christian nation to be the fruit of genuine revival in our country. It's not going to be the cause of genuine revival in our nation. It's going to be ordinary faithfulness, everyday obedience, which in our time requires courage. Today, to be an ordinary Christian like Charlie Kirk requires courage. Our goal is not to, go back to the 50s. We need to, although the 50s, I would prefer the morality of that time to ours, absolutely. But we got to learn from the decades following the 50s that external morality, cultural Christianity did not prevent the radical degradation of our culture that we've experienced over the last 75 years. And so we've got to be looking for something more than just simply, for Christianity to be cool or to be normal. We need it to be real in our lives.
Yeah, I mean, that's really good, Larson. I mean, I totally agree with you. And again, I think that time will tell what the result is, what the fallout is after Charlie Kirk's martyrdom. Every government God has ordained has something to do in a situation like the one that we're in. And every government God, and by every government, I mean church, family, and state. Those are the three basic governments God has ordained, the three basic spheres. They all need reformation. They all need renewal and transformation according to God's word. They're all in pretty bad shape, really, in our day. There is a lot to be done on the political front, but there's really no political solution to the problems that we face. The problems we face go so much deeper than mere politics. You're not going to change the whole direction of the country simply by who you vote for. There's so much more to be done. Even if we did elect a much more faithful, consistent Christian candidate than Donald Trump, there's still going to be pretty tight limits on what he can actually accomplish apart from a willingness of the citizenry. And the American system, as we well know, was designed to work for a Christian people, and it will not work for any other people. The problem is not that the system's broken. The problem is that the people are broken. Okay. Obviously, there are things you could criticize about the American Constitution and the American founders and whatnot, but the system that they devised for the governance of our nation works. It's not the problem. The problem is that the people no longer have the character and virtue necessary to make the system function. And you're not going to solve that just through politics. So what do we need? If there's not a political solution, there's not a political solution, because what we're dealing with is sin, which requires repentance. We're dealing with demonic principalities and powers, which requires a kind of exorcism. There's just more here. You're not going to vote your way to an exorcism. You're not going to vote your way to repentance. Now, when we repent, our politics will change. When we repent, that will be manifested politically. And I do think the fact that American Christians have pushed back so hard just in the last 5 years or so is a great sign that there's still spiritual vitality in our nation. Christians 5 years ago could have black-pilled. We could have swallowed the black pill, given up, surrendered. That's what David French and Russell Moore did. They basically just said, hey, progressivism is going to rule from here on out. We surrender. So you guys set terms, and we'll just play in our little corner over here, and we won't say anything that offends you guys. That's basically what those people did. But I love people like Charlie Kirk and Doug Wilson, who decided to fight back. And the amazing thing is, you can't say that we've won definitively. We haven't won the war, but you can certainly say we've won a lot of battles, and we've won a lot of battles that did not seem winnable as recently as 5 years ago. Even these people celebrating over Charlie Kirk's death, had this happened 5 years ago, I don't think any of them would have been fired, because I think there was so much momentum behind progressivism at that point. And G.K. Chesterton has that line where he says, there's nothing better than fighting for a lost cause and not losing. And I really feel like that's what we've done over the last 5 years. We decided to fight for a lost cause, and we realized it wasn't lost after all. And that's a beautiful thing.
The evidence of that is, the fact that JD Vance, gets in front of the nation this week, and in his talk, he is quoting clearly from memory, the Lord's Prayer and the Nicene Creed and Scripture. He's not a perfect Christian, right? But he is so much closer to the kind of bold proclamation of the truth of Scripture. He's so much closer to what we've been hoping and praying for so long. And I don't think any of us, 5 years ago, would you have said there's going to be a vice president in the White House, or would the White House share a video of a man preaching the gospel? I would have said, you're crazy. Not in my lifetime, much less in 5 years.
It's amazing how quickly things can change. And I do think the fact that JD Vance in that talk, and there's about a 13-minute clip of it. I know he hosted the whole Charlie Kirk show that day, is my understanding. But I watched that last 13-minute segment, and it is just amazing. And in it, he does use some language there, so it's be careful.
Right, it's a little rough around the edges. It's all right, we'll take it.
Around the edges. Well, he is from Ohio, but but he's reciting the Nicene Creed, like you said, in the Lord's Prayer, and he's doing this saying, this is my faith too. This is what shapes me. And obviously, you got Vance, who is a Roman Catholic, and you've got Kirk, who was basically just like a low church, sort of Calvary Chapel evangelical, but they were good friends. And I think that's a beautiful picture of the kind of unity that we can't have on the right. Not that we set aside those theological differences, but certainly when it comes to politics, when it comes to the culture war, we can band together with people like that, and we can form coalitions to fight these kinds of battles that need to be fought. And it really is amazing how quickly things can change. I've been very impressed with JD Vance.
Yeah, one of the things that I think has changed and has ended, and it is that the conservative movement can advance without a deeper source of truth and meaning and purpose. And I was really encouraged to see Ben Shapiro, who's a famously conservative Jew. He was on Turning Point, I think their blog or podcast, and he said we're donating, Daily Wire is donating $1 million to the Turning Point and we want it to be used for the advancement of Christ. he said because the power of what Turning Point was doing was not its political trajectory. It was that it was reaching hearts for Christ, and that's what is driving. It's ultimately what's going to have the staying power and the real transformative power to a political movement. So even as a guy who's not a proclaiming Christian, he's acknowledging we can't just push politics and sort of be agnostic on religion. And I think that there's been this movement, right, of guys like Elon Musk who are not believers but are very outspoken conservatives, or Joe Rogan, and there's a lot, right, in our time. But I think that is moving in the right direction right now, and that's really encouraging.
Yep, it's good to see. So we need to pray it continues. We need to work to that end, and
well, and the principle of pursuit, right? I mean, Doug Wilson reminded us of that on Twitter this week. Just that this is a moment to remember the principle, the warfare principle of pursuit. That when you've got them on the run, like, don't stop. You need to keep this. If ever there was a time to dig deep and push harder, this is it. And so I hope that we are not, as a church especially, going to be overly eager to go back to the comfortable days, back to life as it was a week ago, and kind of go back to sleep. I hope that this will be a moment that will energize us to step up and to keep pushing.
Well, Larson, this has been great. It's been a while, so it's good to get back with you. So enjoyed it.
Hey, thanks for doing it, and we'll get on the calendar and get another one of these booked. God bless you, sir.
Yep, you too.
All right, we'll see you.